History is not a stone monument. We like to think it is, fixed, cold, and unchangeable. But in reality, history is more like a crime scene where the perpetrator was also the lead investigator. For 2 centuries, we have viewed the Napoleonic era through the lens he polished for us. We see the gold braid, the white horse, and the strategic genius. But what if the most important orders he ever gave were the ones he thought no one would ever read? Deep in the heart of Paris, tucked away in the sub-basements of the Archives Nationales, there is a silence that feels heavy. It's the smell of decaying vellum and ancient dust. In 2004, a researcher pulling a misplaced box from a shelf found a scrap of paper that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't written in French, it wasn't written in Italian, it was written in numbers, thousands of them. 341, 62, 982, 11. This wasn't just a ledger or a supply list. This was a direct dispatch from the desk of the emperor himself, dated to the height of the 1812 Russian campaign. But there was a problem. For nearly 200 years, this document was effectively invisible. Not because it was hidden behind a false wall, but because it was trapped behind the great cipher. To understand the weight of this discovery, you have to understand the man. Napoleon Bonaparte was obsessed with the flow of information. He understood that a battle is won with cannons, but an empire is held with secrets. He created the Bureau Noir, the Black Office, a shadow department of cryptographers whose only job was to break the mail of every diplomat in Europe, while ensuring the emperor's own words remained impenetrable. The Great Cipher was his masterpiece of paranoia. While most military codes of the time used a few hundred variations, Napoleon's 1812 code utilized a staggering 2,360 unique numbers. Imagine a puzzle where every piece can change its shape, depending on the piece next to it. To the casual observer or even a captured courier, these letters looked like the ramblings of a mad accountant. Napoleon was so confident in this system that he wrote his most candid, most brutal, and most incriminating thoughts in these digits. He believed that even if the Russians captured his messengers, which they did frequently, they would be staring at a wall of gibberish. And for 2 centuries, he was right. But as the researcher held that parchment under the sterile glow of an LED lamp, they noticed something the archives had missed. This wasn't a copy. It was an original, bearing the frantic indentation of the emperor's quill. When modern cryptologists, led by experts like Jean-Christophe Perisseau, finally applied 21st century processing power to these unbreakable numbers, the wall didn't just crack, it shattered. As the numbers transformed back into words, the little corporal we knew from the textbooks began to vanish. In his place stood a man gripped by a terrifying realization. The empire was failing, and the official version of the war he was sending back to the newspapers in Paris was a total fabrication. The history books say that in October 1812, Napoleon began a strategic withdrawal from Moscow. They speak of a dignified retreat, but the secret orders tell a different story. They speak of a command to erase history itself, to burn landmarks, to abandon the wounded, and to execute a scorched earth policy that even his most loyal marshals found abhorrent. To understand the secret orders, you have to understand the man who lived in fear of the truth. Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just a general. He was perhaps the world's first modern propaganda minister. He knew that an army could be defeated on the field, but an emperor could only be toppled if he lost control of the narrative. Long before the secret dispatches of 1812 were written, Napoleon had already built a fortress around the French mind. This was the Bureau Noir, the Black Office, the shadow in the mailroom. Imagine a grand, silent room in the heart of Paris. Every day, thousands of letters from across the empire, from lovers, merchants, and diplomats pass through this room. And every day, skilled handlers use steam to melt wax seals, read the contents, and carefully reseal them without leaving a trace. Napoleon's police chief, Joseph Fouché, and his postmaster, Antoine Lavalette, were the gatekeepers. If a letter contained a hint of dissent, it vanished. If it contained a secret, it was copied and put on the emperor's desk before the recipient even knew it existed. But the Bureau Noir wasn't just about reading other people's mail. It was about protecting Napoleon's own. He was obsessed with the great cipher, because he knew that if his true thoughts reached the public, the myth of the invincible god of war would shatter. The propaganda machine. While the secret codes were being drafted in the shadows, the Moniteur Universel, the official state newspaper, was printing the legend. Napoleon personally edited the bulletins. He would sit in his tent, surrounded by the frozen corpses of his Grande Armée, and write headlines about strategic maneuvers and heroic morale. He once famously said, "4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets." This wasn't just ego, it was a calculated survival tactic. If the people of Paris knew the 1812 campaign was a slaughterhouse, they would revolt. If the kings of Europe knew his army was starving, they would pounce. The cipher was the only thing standing between the reality of his failure and the survival of his throne. The invention of the lie. The genius of Napoleon's silence was its scale. He didn't just hide small facts, he hid entire disasters. In this chapter of his life, we see the transition from a leader to a ghostwriter. He began issuing orders that were meant to be read by his marshals, and then immediately destroyed. He created a double reality. In the first reality, the one the world saw, he was the enlightened bringer of the Napoleonic Code. In the second reality, the one hidden behind those 2,360 numbers, he was a desperate man ordering the execution of prisoners and the burning of entire cities to cover his tracks. The Bureau Noir was the laboratory where the truth was dissected and reassembled. But, as the winter of 1812 approached, even the greatest cryptographers in Paris couldn't hide the smell of smoke rising from Moscow. The year 1812 remains the greatest scar on the Napoleonic legend. History tells us of the Grande Armée, the largest military force ever assembled in Europe, marching into the vastness of Russia with 600,000 men. We are taught about the tactical brilliance of the Battle of Borodino and the eventual tragic retreat through the snow. But the official dispatches sent back to Paris during this time were a masterpiece of fiction. While the public read about a triumphant emperor resting in the heart of the Kremlin, the secret coded dispatches revealed a man watching his empire dissolve in real time. The paper trail of a dying army. As Napoleon sat in the scorched shell of Moscow, he was writing 2 versions of the war. The first version, meant for the French newspapers, described a successful occupation. He spoke of the excellent health of his troops and the abundance of supplies found in the city. The second version, the one hidden behind the 2,360 numbered Great Cipher, was a frantic series of commands to his generals. These were the dispatches of desperation. In these private letters, the numbers told the truth. The horses were dying by the thousands, the supply lines were severed, and the Grand Army was becoming a mob of starving ghosts. The 29th Bulletin versus the secret reality. The most famous example of this historical gaslighting is the 29th Bulletin. Released to the public in December 1812, it finally admitted the army had suffered, but blamed it entirely on the suddenness of the cold. It famously ended with the line, "The health of His Majesty has never been better." However, the decoded secret orders from the weeks leading up to that bulletin tell a darker story. Napoleon wasn't just worried about the weather, he was terrified of a coup in Paris. He was issuing coded orders to his inner circle to prepare for his secret abandonment of the army. He was planning his flight back to France while his men were still freezing to death on the banks of the Berezina River. The erasure of failure. The secret dispatches from the 1812 campaign are unique because they show Napoleon attempting to pre-write the history of his defeat. He issued coded instructions to his ministers to seize and destroy any letters from lower-ranking officers that contradicted his official narrative. He knew that if the letters of common soldiers reached their families, the truth about the 1812 disaster would bypass the Bureau Noir. In these dispatches, we see the emperor's true priority. It wasn't the lives of his 500,000 lost soldiers. It was the preservation of his image as an infallible god of war. He was using the Great Cipher to micromanage a cover-up from 1,500 miles away. The weight of the ink. When historians finally broke the 1812 codes in the modern era, they found a man who was no longer the architect of Europe, but the architect of deception. The dispatches reveal that Napoleon knew the war was lost as early as October, months before he admitted it to the world. He stayed in Moscow not because he thought he could win, but because he was trying to figure out how to frame the defeat in a way that wouldn't cost him his throne. The secret orders were his laboratory for the big lie. The most chilling of these orders, however, wasn't about the retreat or the soldiers. It was about a specific target in the heart of Moscow, a target that represented the soul of Russia. History remembers Napoleon Bonaparte as a lawgiver, a modernizer, and a brilliant strategist. But the decoded dispatches of October 1812 reveal a different face. A man consumed by a cold, vengeful fury. When the King of Kings realized that Moscow would not be the trophy that forced the Tsar to his knees, he decided that if he couldn't have the soul of Russia, no one would. On October 20th, 1812, at 3 o'clock in the morning, a messenger galloped out of the smoke-filled ruins of Moscow. He carried a letter addressed to Marshal Mortier, the Duke of Treviso. It was a document intended for the shadows, shrouded in the impenetrable rose of the great cipher. The command of a spited god. The message was brief, brutal, and utterly clear once the 2360 number code was finally stripped away by modern cryptanalysts. It read, "I am going to blow up the Kremlin." This wasn't a tactical military strike. The Kremlin wasn't a munitions factory or a barracks of strategic importance at that stage of the retreat. It was a symbolic execution. To Napoleon, the Kremlin was the physical manifestation of Russian history, religion, and sovereignty. By ordering its destruction, he wasn't trying to win a war he had already lost. He was trying to delete the enemy's heritage, the logistics of vengeance. The secret orders detailed a horrific engineering project. Under the cover of the Great Cipher, Napoleon instructed his engineers to pack the foundations of the ancient palaces and the towering Ivan the Great bell tower with 2 tons of gunpowder. He didn't want the world to know this was an act of desperation. In his official bulletins to Paris, he claimed the Russians themselves were burning their own city. But the encrypted numbers tell the truth. The emperor personally oversaw the placement of the fuses. He wanted the explosion to be timed so that he would be miles away, watching the horizon glow from the safety of his carriage, while the heart of Russia was torn out. The failure of the fuse. What makes this secret order so fascinating to historians is not just the intent, but the result. As the French army retreated, a torrential rain began to fall, the very same weather that would soon turn into the deadly Russian winter. The rain soaked many of the fuses. While several buildings were shattered and the walls were breached in sections, the great Ivan the Great bell tower stood firm, and the massive explosions Napoleon had envisioned were partially stifled by the mud and the water. Why the cipher? Why was this order encrypted so heavily? Because Napoleon knew that blowing up a city's religious and cultural heart was an act of barbarism, a term he often used to describe his enemies. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a civilizer. To be caught ordering the wanton destruction of a European capital's historic center would ruin his carefully crafted image as a noble conqueror. The Great Cipher was his shield against the judgment of history. He believed that by the time anyone could read these numbers, he would be long dead, and his legend would be safe. He didn't account for the fact that 200 years later, the very technology he helped pioneer, advanced mathematics and systemic logic, would be the tools used to unmask him. The Kremlin order marks the exact moment Napoleon's campaign shifted from a quest for glory to a petty, destructive exit. It was the beginning of the end, written in the cold, hard digits of a man who realized he was no longer a master of the world, but a fugitive in the snow. If you were a marshal of the empire in 1812, you were one of the most powerful men in the world. You commanded tens of thousands of lives and held the fate of nations in your hands. But you were also living in a gilded cage. To Napoleon, loyalty was not a permanent state. It was a variable that had to be constantly measured, calculated, and if necessary, manipulated through the Great Cipher. As the Russian winter set in and the Grande Armée began to dissolve, the emperor's paranoia turned inward. He began to suspect that his most trusted commanders were no longer looking at the map for victory, but looking at the horizon for an escape. The emperor's shadow network, Napoleon's secret dispatches during the retreat, weren't just directed at the enemy or his ministers in Paris. A significant portion of the encrypted traffic was a horizontal web of espionage. He used a triple-entry system of communication. He would send an official order to a marshal, a second coded letter to that marshal's chief of staff to verify the first was received, and a third secret dispatch to a paid informant within the same unit to report on the marshal's reaction. One of the most frequent targets of these shadow orders was Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law and the King of Naples. Murat was the greatest cavalry commander of the age, but Napoleon sensed his vanity was reaching a breaking point. Decoded letters reveal that Napoleon was intercepting Murat's private correspondence with the Austrians and using the Great Cipher to instruct his secret police to shadow Murat's every move. The Bernadotte Dead Zone. The most chilling use of the secret codes involved Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a former French marshal who would become the Crown Prince of Sweden. Napoleon never forgave what he saw as the ultimate betrayal, a Frenchman leading a foreign nation against him. The secret orders of 1812 contained blacklists of officers suspected of being Bernadottists, men who believed the Napoleonic era was over and were secretly communicating with the Swedish prince. Napoleon used the 2360 number code to order the silent removal of these officers from the front lines. They didn't face court-martials, they were simply assigned to suicide missions, or lost in the chaotic shuffle of the retreat. The silence of the bravest of the brave, even Marshal Ney, famously called the bravest of the brave, was not immune. While Napoleon publicly praised Ney's rearguard actions in the snow, his secret dispatches to Paris painted a different picture. He was building a file of failures to blame for the Russian disaster, ensuring that if the empire fell, the history books would blame his generals' incompetence rather than his own hubris. He was using the cipher to create an insurance policy of blame. He ensured his marshals remained loyal out of fear, never knowing exactly what the emperor was writing about them to the Ministry of Police in Paris. The fracture of the elite. This chapter of the secret orders reveals the true rot at the heart of the empire. The Grande Armée wasn't just being defeated by the Russian winter or the Cossacks, it was being hollowed out by a lack of trust. Napoleon's obsession with the Great Cipher had backfired. Because he communicated so much through code and secrecy, his marshals began to do the same. They created their own smaller ciphers, their own private networks, and their own secret plans for a post-Napoleonic world. The architect of silence had taught his pupils too well. As the army crossed the frozen Berezina River, the secret orders weren't about troop movements anymore. They were about survival, surveillance, and the bitter realization that the emperor was now as afraid of his friends as he was of his enemies. To the untrained eye, a Napoleonic dispatch from 1812 looks like a chaotic sea of ink, a ledger of a madman, but to the initiates of the Bureau Noir, it was a clockwork masterpiece. While most of Europe was still using simple substitution ciphers, where A equals 1 and B equals 2, Napoleon was operating on a level of mathematical complexity that wouldn't be standardized for another century. This was the Great Cipher, and for 200 years, it was the ultimate cold case of historical cryptography, the anatomy of the 2360. The Great Cipher was not a letter-for-letter code. It was a syllabic and nomenclator system. Most codes of the era had a vocabulary of maybe 200 or 300 numbers. Napoleon's jumped to an astounding 2360. In this system, a single number didn't just represent a letter. One number might represent a common syllable like terre or meant. Another might represent a specific person, like Tsar Alexander or Marshal Ney. A third might represent an entire phrase, such as march at dawn or burn the village. But the true genius and the true frustration for interceptors was the homophone. Napoleon's codebreakers assigned multiple different numbers to the same common letters or syllables. The letter E, the most common in French, might be represented by 15 different numbers scattered throughout the codebook. This defeated frequency analysis, the primary tool of codebreakers who look for patterns of repeating characters to crack a language. In the Great Cipher, there were no patterns. The numbers looked like white noise. The naked courier. Napoleon was so confident in this science that he often sent couriers through enemy lines with almost no escort. He knew the Russian Cossacks were roaming the woods, and he knew his messengers were likely to be captured. To Napoleon, the man was expendable. The paper was invincible. If a Russian general captured a French dispatch, he would see a string of numbers like 34, 821, 445, 19, 2201. Without the petit tableau, the small tabular key kept in a silk pouch around the necks of only a few elite officers, that paper was just a fire starter. the man who broke the emperor. For 2 centuries, these documents sat in the French National Archives, categorized as unreadable. They were the ghosts of the 1812 campaign. It wasn't until the early 2000s that a researcher named Jean-Christophe Perazat took on the challenge. Perazat didn't just use a computer. He had to think like a 19th century Frenchman. He began by looking for cribs, pieces of information he already knew. He looked at dispatches sent on specific dates and compared them to known historical events. If a letter was sent the day the Kremlin was mined, he searched for the numerical patterns for powder, fire, or Kremlin. The breakthrough came when he realized the code wasn't just numbers, it was a linguistic map of Napoleon's mind. The most frequent numbers weren't just vowels, they were military terms: advance, retreat, rations, and death. The forensic revelation. When the code was finally cracked, it did more than just translate words. It provided a forensic timeline of Napoleon's mental state. By analyzing the shorthand used in the codes, researchers could see when the emperor was calm, using complex, multi-layered encryption, and when he was panicked, reverting to simpler, repetitive number strings. The science of the secret revealed that by the end of 1812, the great cipher was breaking down, not because the Russians had cracked it, but because the French were too exhausted, too cold, and too terrified to use it correctly. The unbreakable code was eventually defeated by the frozen fingers of the men tasked with writing it. In March 1815, the ogre returned. Napoleon Bonaparte, having escaped his exile on the island of Elba, landed on the shores of France and began a bloodless march to Paris. But as he reclaimed his throne, for what history calls the 100 Days, his primary enemy wasn't the approaching British or Prussian armies. His primary enemy was the paper trail he had left behind. While the world watched the military buildup, a secret war was being waged in the archives of the Tuileries Palace. Napoleon knew that during his first exile, the Bourbon Restoration had gained access to his private files. He was terrified of what they had found and what they were about to publish. The Great Purge. The moment Napoleon re-entered Paris, one of his first orders wasn't to the infantry, but to his most trusted librarians and secretaries. They were tasked with a systematic cleansing of the state records. He needed to erase the evidence of his 1812 failures, and more importantly, the secret orders that proved he had planned to abandon his army in Russia. The Great Cipher had protected his messages during the war, but now that he was back in power, the physical letters themselves were a liability. Witnesses from the time describe hearths in the palace overflowing with the ash of burned dispatches. The forgery of the liberal emperor. Napoleon realized that if he couldn't destroy all the evidence, he would simply overwrite it. During the 100 Days, he attempted to rebrand himself as a man of peace and a liberal emperor. He began issuing retroactive orders, backdated documents written in 1815, but dated to 1812 or 1813. These forgeries were designed to make it look as though he had always intended to grant France a constitution, or that he had argued against the more brutal tactics of his Russian campaign. He was using his final months of power to perform a deep-fake operation on history itself. The hunt for the lost ciphers. Napoleon's paranoia focused on a specific set of documents: the correspondence between him and his police chiefs regarding the surveillance of the French people. He knew that if the public saw the sheer scale of the Bureau Noir's domestic spying, his hero of the people persona would vanish. He dispatched agents to recover secret files held by his former ministers, some of whom had gone into hiding or switched sides. This was a high-stakes race. The Bourbon loyalists were trying to smuggle these same documents out of the country to prove to the world that Napoleon was a tyrant, while Napoleon's men were authorized to use any means necessary to retrieve and burn them. The archive that survived. Despite his best efforts, Napoleon was fighting a losing battle against time. The sheer volume of the Napoleonic bureaucracy was too vast to be scrubbed clean in 100 days. While he burned thousands of pages in Paris, copies of his secret coded orders remained scattered in the baggage trains of his distant marshals and in the dusty corners of provincial post offices. These survivors, the ghosts of his first reign, are what modern historians eventually discovered. They represent the cracks in the emperor's carefully constructed mask. Napoleon could command an army to charge at Waterloo, but he could not command every piece of paper in Europe to turn to ash. The final forgery was an attempt to ensure that if he fell again, his legend would remain intact. He was preparing for his final act, the transition from a living emperor to a historical myth. But as we will see in the next chapter, even in the lonely silence of the South Atlantic, he was still trying to edit the past. Gemini said, Chapter 8, The St. Helena Last Stand. By 1815, the thunder of cannons had ceased. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe was now confined to a damp, windswept house on a volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, St. Helena. But while his physical body was a prisoner of the British, his mind remained a general. He realized that the ultimate battle was no longer for territory, but for the collective memory of the world. In this final exile, Napoleon embarked on his most successful campaign of deception. He traded his sword for a pen and transformed his final years into a massive editorial project, the dictation of the myth. Napoleon spent his days in a feverish state of dictation, surrounded by a small circle of loyalists, most notably the Count de las Cases. He began producing the Memorial of St. Helena. This wasn't a memoir, it was a curated reconstruction. In these sessions, Napoleon would remember events differently than they had occurred. When confronted with his failures in Russia, or the brutal secret orders he had issued, he would frame them as the fault of his subordinates, or as unfortunate necessities forced upon him by the British. He was essentially writing the director's cut of his life, removing the scenes that didn't fit the hero's journey. The War of the Archives. Napoleon knew that the British and the French Bourbons were publishing their own versions of his secret history. He was obsessed with the black legend being built against him. To counter it, he used his remaining hidden funds to smuggle letters and corrected official documents back to Europe. He was essentially running a clandestine publishing house from the most remote island on Earth. He would send secret instructions to his supporters in London and Paris, telling them which newspapers to influence and which secret but forged documents to leak to the press to discredit the survivors of the Bureau Noir. The silence of the grave. One of the most telling aspects of his time on St. Helena was his reaction to the mention of his coded dispatches. Whenever his companions brought up the 1812 campaign or the Great Cipher, Napoleon would often become evasive or rewrite the context entirely. He claimed that his ciphers were only used to protect his generals from enemy spies, never admitting that they were used to spy on the generals themselves. He was terrified that the keys to the Great Cipher would fall into the wrong hands. He knew that as long as the 2360 number code remained unbroken, his private commands, like the order to destroy the Kremlin or the surveillance of his marshals, would remain safely buried in the archives, protected by the complexity of the math. The legacy of the last stand. Napoleon's last stand on St. Helena worked brilliantly. The Memorial of St. Helena became the primary source for historians. His version of the story, the tragic hero betrayed by fate and the weather, became the dominant narrative. He had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of eloquent prose. He died in 1821, believing he had won. He assumed that the secret orders would eventually rot away in the damp Parisian cellars, or remain forever locked behind a code that no one would have the patience to break. But time is the ultimate code breaker. For nearly 2 centuries, the secret heart of the First Empire was protected by a wall of numbers. The Great Cipher hadn't just hidden Napoleon's words, it had frozen them in time. But in the early 2000s, the wall began to crumble. This wasn't the result of a lucky guess or a found key. It was a feat of historical forensic science that finally stripped the mask off the emperor. The digital siege. The breakthrough began with a team of researchers at the Fondation Napoleon and a dedicated cryptographer named Jean-Christophe Perisseau. They were faced with over 150,000 documents, thousands of which were written entirely in the 2360 number code. Previous attempts to crack the code had failed because they looked for a simple alphabet. But Perisseau realized the Great Cipher was a nomenclator, a hybrid system that used numbers to represent whole words, syllables, and names. Using modern computing, they began a brute force attack on the sequences, looking for repetitions that matched the known rhythms of 19th century French military grammar. The moment of clarity, the aha moment, came when the team identified the number 447. It appeared with rhythmic regularity in dispatches sent from the front lines in Russia. Based on the context of the retreat, they tested the word fusil, rifle, then Freud, cold, and finally the word that unlocked the cabinet, Moscow. As the code shattered, the narrative changed. We didn't just find a few missing details, we found a completely different man. The decoded letters revealed that Napoleon was far more aware of the impending catastrophe than he ever admitted in his memoirs. We found orders sent in late October 1812, weeks before the public knew of any trouble, where Napoleon was already coordinating the secret transport of his personal treasure and archives, essentially planning his own exit, while publicly ordering his men to hold at all costs. The smoking gun of the Kremlin, perhaps the most significant revelation, was the full, unedited text of the order to blow up the Kremlin. For years, Napoleonic apologists claimed the destruction was a chaotic accident of war or a low-level command. The decoded dispatch proved it was a direct, calculated, and highly specific order from the emperor's own hand. It revealed a level of micromanagement that was chilling. Napoleon wasn't just ordering a demolition, he was specifying which towers should fall and expressing a desire for the explosion to be spectacular. Beyond the words, the psychology of a fugitive, the codebreakers found that as the retreat worsened, the encryption became more frantic. There are letters where the numbers are scribbled so hastily they are nearly illegible, evidence of a man writing by candlelight in a freezing tent. Knowing that the Cossacks were only miles away, these revelations did something that the history books had failed to do for 200 years. They humanized the myth, but not in the way Napoleon would have liked. They showed a man who was terrified, vengeful, and willing to sacrifice every person under his command to save his own reputation. The Great Cipher was the last piece of the Napoleonic legend to fall. By breaking it, we didn't just translate a language, we conducted an autopsy on a dead empire. History is often called a set of lies agreed upon, a cynical phrase famously attributed to Napoleon himself. He believed that if he could control the ink, he could control the future. But the ultimate lesson of the Great Cipher is that the truth has a way of outliving the man who tried to bury it. The failure of erasure. Napoleon Bonaparte was arguably the most successful image consultant in human history. He managed to transform a catastrophic defeat in Russia into a tale of tragic heroism that lasted for 2 centuries. He spent his final days on St. Helena, carefully pruning the hedges of his own legacy, ensuring that the world would remember the liberator of Europe rather than the desperate fugitive of 1812. But he failed. He failed because he underestimated the persistence of the paper trail. Despite the fires in the Tuileries, despite the secret police, and despite the complexity of the 2360 number code, the truth remained dormant in the archives, waiting for the technology of the future to catch up to the paranoia of the past. The ghost in the machine. Today, the ghost in the archive is a reminder that no power is absolute. The secret orders Napoleon tried to erase, the commands to burn the Kremlin, the surveillance of his own marshals, the frantic planning of his own escape, serve as a corrective lens. They don't necessarily erase his genius, but they strip away the divinity. When we read the decoded dispatches, we see the little corporal not as a statue in a town square, but as a man gripped by the same fears, pettiness, and desperation as any other. The Great Cipher was his ultimate armor, but once it was pierced, it revealed the hollow spaces in his legend. The lesson for the modern age. The story of Napoleon's secret orders is more relevant today than ever. We live in an era of digital encryption and state-sponsored narratives, where the truth is often hidden behind layers of modern-day ciphers. Napoleon's failure to erase his past proves that even the most powerful person on earth cannot fully silence the record of their actions. Every time a researcher uncovers a new coded letter in a dusty Parisian basement, Napoleon's carefully constructed myth is challenged. It reminds us that history is a living, breathing entity, not a static story told by the winners, but a puzzle that we are still solving. The final seal. As the script for this journey comes to a close, we are left with a final image. The emperor in his study, painstakingly turning words into numbers, believing he was speaking only to the future he had designed. He thought he was erasing his tracks. Instead, he was leaving behind the very keys we would use to find him. The messages Napoleon tried to erase from history are now the very things that help us understand him best. The silence he tried to impose has become a roar, echoing through the centuries, reminding us that the ink of truth, no matter how deeply hidden, never truly dries.